All right. Okay, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Thanks for joining us. We have with us Dr. Makeba Jones, who's an associate teaching professor in the Department of Education Studies at UCSD. Dr. Jones' expertise, um, research, and professional experiences include educational equity, the social and cultural organization of schools, urban school reform, student engagement, youth leadership and development, youth transitions to college, and teacher professional learning. She has collaborated with teachers, students, and administrators on a range of school improvement initiatives and youth development projects for underserved communities of color across San Diego County for over 20 years. All right, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. This is kind of a different venue, different audience. So of course, I wish we were in person. It's so much more fun, but I appreciate you inviting me. So I'll do a quick little introduction that kind of complements Edward's intro really quickly, and then I'll hit the ground running talking about few big ideas from my main area, which is urban school reform, and what we know, what in terms of we meaning the field of education, what we know about what works for all kids, regardless of their background. So I'm an LA girl, so I always like to tell people that. So obviously, you know that I'm a professor, but I'm also an alumna of UCSD. I was a sociology and anthropology major many years ago. So for over 20 years, largely in San Diego County, I think I've worked with, I don't know, 25 to 30 schools, elementary, middle, and high school. All of them serve low-income communities, mostly communities of color. And so I've worked with teachers to change their practices. I've worked with administrators to change policies that work against low-income students and students of color. I've done some work to actually change teachers and administrators' perceptions of students so that, you know, there are more positive relationships between teachers and students, or even between administrators and students. So, you know, why the focus on urban schools, or why the focus on mostly, you know, communities of color? Because we know from the field of education, and I'm going to give you a tiny little bit of slice of example, that for decades and decades in this country, there are persistent gaps between students from different racial ethnic backgrounds, social class backgrounds, and certainly language backgrounds. Mostly students of color are the groups who are not being well served by education. So Latinx individuals, African Americans, Native American Indians, Southeast Asian students, and immigrant students. Low-income students, absolutely, but also English language learners. So students whose first language is not English and they're in schools in the United States helping to learn English. We also know that schools who serve, you know, mostly low-income communities are absolutely under-resourced. They have, you know, the most outdated materials, textbooks, computers, those kinds of things, usually the lowest number of qualified teachers, and a lot of their facilities and even the classrooms are run down and completely crowded. So I want to give you a tiny slice of sort of the history of these persistent gaps. So this is federal data. Every few years or so, the federal government, the Department of Education, collects data on how students from like second grade to maybe 11th grade are doing in the United States. I just chose 8th grade math as an example. This is how the data is represented by the federal government. Math is typically a gatekeeper. Math is usually the subject that if you're able to graduate from high school, great, but it's often the subject that keeps kids from being eligible for a four-year college by the time that they graduate from high school. Even students who transfer from community college to a four-year university, historically, certainly in the last like 20 years, have tended to need remediation in mathematics. So you want all kids to score at proficient. When a kid scores at proficient, proficient, that means that they understand the material. They are probably doing very well in school. They're going to graduate from high school. They're absolutely going to be eligible for a four-year college. Once you get into the basic, maybe you have a shot of graduating from high school, you're probably not going to be eligible for a four-year college. Below basic is frightening, right? Because these kids may or may not graduate from high school. They certainly are not going to be eligible from college. And you can just see, just scanning the years, that very little has changed. Certainly, you know, if you look just in the last like 10 years as an example, very little has changed. So these are all eighth graders in the United States. But if you break it down just a little bit, the problem is even worse. So these are students who are, would be considered low-income students. So when you go to school, you have the option of getting a free lunch. You fill out this long application, and that's how schools know if a student qualifies for low income. Look at the scores for these eighth graders who come from low income backgrounds, right? Below basic, like this scares me every time I see this, because so little has changed. So little has changed. Again, just looking over a 10-year period. I'll show you one, I think maybe one last data point for English learners. This makes me cry. Every time I see this slide, it makes me cry. Look at this. Between 2003 and 2019, over 70% of all English language learners, that's every language, not just Spanish, which is the most dominant in the United States, every single language is represented here, right? This is frightening. So one of the questions that I always, that I'm always interested in is, how do we explain these disparities that clearly have been happening for decades, right? So the dominant narrative in the United States is that all schools are fair and all schools provide equal opportunity. The idea is that schools equalize differences in your background, so it doesn't matter if you come from a low income, middle income, high income background, all kids get the same thing in school, right? And then they have options to do whatever they want after school. Get a job, go to college. If you're familiar with the phrase, the American dream, rags to riches story, this is the narrative that sort of promotes this idea, right? That all kids get the same thing. But the flip side of this narrative is, well, what about the students who struggle in school? What about the data that I just shared with you about English language learners and students from low-income backgrounds? This narrative says that students who are not successful in school have only themselves to blame. There's no reason to analyze school. There's no reason to question what schools are doing. If there's inequality or disparities in student achievement, then students are to blame. So this narrative suggests that education is neutral, that education does not take sides. So this is a little sort of visual to basically visualize what I've just said, right? Some of you may be familiar with this. This is the narrative that most people in the United States love, right? This is what the media popularizes all of the time, that all schools need is an equal distribution of resources, right? So, every kid needs the same ladder, the same height for a ladder, right? And again, the narrative is, you still can't reach the tree, then there must be something wrong with you. Because as a school, we've given you the assistance that you should need in order to sort of reach your goal. So again, if students don't utilize those resources, then it's their fault. I'll come back to that. What I do is I look inside of schools, right? What's happening in schools, what's happening in classrooms. And you could go into any school in the United States and look at these features or components, and absolutely, without talking to one adult, if you just looked at these things, you would be able to see how adults in that school feel about kids. And I want you to think about your own experiences. I'm just going to give you like a few examples from this list. So, physical quality of schools, right? Did your school have an open layout? Was it restrictive? Were there bars on the window, locked gates, metal detectors? What about the condition of the buildings or the classrooms? Were the desks fairly new? Were they run down? Did you have outdated textbooks, the latest science equipment, the latest computers? What about, in kind of common areas like on the lunch yard, right? The bathrooms. Why do I ask this? So I don't even know how many, several hundreds of high school students and middle school students specifically I've worked with in San Diego. I cannot tell you how many times teenagers have come up to me and said, Dr. Jones, this school hates teenagers. And I would ask, well, how do you know that? And they said, because there's never any toilet paper in the bathroom. There's never any paper towels in the bathroom. Or there's only one place on the campus to have lunch, to sit down, right, and relax. And all of the tables are covered in bird crap. The school never cleans the lunch tables. So literally, I'm standing there for 35 minutes holding my lunch because all of the tables where I'm supposed to sit are covered in bird crap, right? So again, these things communicate something to kids in terms of how adults in the school feel about them. What about school routines for keeping order? Do students feel trusted, right? It's pretty common in many high schools in the United States. If you're a senior, you can leave campus for lunch, right? Is there a whole complicated process where you need to show like 2 forms of ID, right? To prove that you're a senior and you're worthy of leaving campus? What if you have to go to the bathroom in the middle of class? Do your teachers trust you to just, walk out, do your business and come back? Do you have to have some kind of hall pass? Do you have to prove to them like, no, I really do need to go. I'm not going to ditch class. Do adults trust students? And then lastly, which is probably one of the most important in terms of inequality, is how schools group students for instruction. So there is a common practice, many of you probably been exposed to it one form or another. There's a common practice called tracking or ability grouping. And it's literally where students are placed in different classes or different tracks, right? So the upper track has all of your honors classes, advanced placement, IB, if those of you that are familiar with international baccalaureate programs. Your regular track obviously has regular classes or average classes, and then you have a remedial track, right? These placements are based on judgments about students' intelligence or academic capability. Sometimes they're based on data, like an IQ test or maybe your prior GPA. A lot of times they're based on teachers' perceptions about whether or not a student has the capacity to take college prep courses, as an example. Tracking does not look the same in every school, but usually what we know from, about 35 years of research is that the best teachers are assigned to the upper track, most experienced, most effective, high expectations for students. They work really hard to support students. The least effective teachers are assigned to the low track. They have the least experience, often low expectations. They don't always seem too interested in helping students. Doesn't seem like they put much planning into their lessons. The upper track curriculum, critical thinking, problem solving through all kinds of assignments, papers, projects, presentations. Lower track, no exposure to critical thinking, no exposure to problem solving, lots of memorization, kind of basic facts, worksheets, fill in the blank assignments, kind of low level work. Upper track kids are absolutely being prepared for college. Lower track students are absolutely not being prepared for college. So this narrative that dominates the United States, the American dream, the rags to riches, it's not true. Students are not getting the same high quality experiences regardless of their background. And lots of research on tracking and ability grouping in particular has shown that it increases inequality for students from low income backgrounds, English language learners, and students of color, because all of them are disproportionately placed in low track classes. So how do you design schools with these issues in mind? So there's been a lot of research on school reform or school transformation. And there's some research that talks about there are multiple dimensions of change. And here's where school change or school design gets really tricky. So the reason why the little technical bubble is a little bit bigger than the rest is because this is the area that schools tend to focus most of their effort on. The technical dimension of change is all of the stuff, all of the material aspects of school reform. It's buying new textbooks, buying new lab equipment, the latest computers, new facilities, a new building, new desks, new chairs, right? It's, new teaching techniques, right? It's even, like reducing class size. Like those are the things that schools tend to obsess over. And they're all incredibly important. The technical part is incredibly important. The cultural dimension of change is all about changing teachers, administrators, counselors' belief systems and attitudes about topics like the expectations of kids, the meanings of intelligence, stereotypes about race or class or gender, stereotypes about students from immigrant backgrounds or English language learners. The cultural dimension is all about addressing bias, prejudice, and stereotyping. The political dimension is all about power dynamics, right? Change brings fear from teachers, administrators, parents, fear of losing something. Teachers, which absolutely a lot of research has shown, can undermine reform because they're afraid of being forced to do something in their classroom. Maybe they taught 8th grade algebra the same way for 15 years, and all of a sudden being asked to do it a different way is terrifying for them. Parents undermine reform all of the time because they're afraid that the quality of their child's education is going to be diminished, and it's going to make it harder for their child to get into college, right? All of these things matter, but the key to successful school transformation is you have to work on all of these simultaneously. Reforms tend to fail in this country when schools only focus on the technical dimension. You have to do it simultaneously. Sometimes the cultural and political dimensions are more important because it does not matter how new and shiny and pretty that thing is, right? iPads for all of the 9th graders, right? Whatever it is, it does not matter how pretty and shiny and new that thing is. If teachers don't believe all kids can learn, then they're not going to use that shiny new thing in the way that it's intended. If teachers carry prejudice or stereotypes about students, then again, it does not matter if they now have iPads for every single kid in their class. They're not going to use that pretty new shiny thing in the way that it's intended. So this idea about the cultural dimension has really undermined a lot of reform efforts, and a lot of researchers over many years have tried to answer this question: what explains all of these disparities in student achievement, looking at what happens in school. And I do the same thing, but I also look at how perceptions of students' backgrounds influences the kinds of education that they receive. Like, we know that stereotypes about students across all kinds of categories affect how schools are structured, they affect how teachers treat students, and it affects how students see themselves. Unfortunately, there are a lot of theories in education, the social sciences, that have argued for many years that students' backgrounds play a big role in influencing how they do in school. That there are certain cultures, certain races or ethnic groups, who don't do well because there's something wrong with their culture, something wrong with their belief system, right? These theories, even though they've been around for a while, are absolutely false. They reflect a lot of stereotype and a lot of prejudice about race and intelligence. So if you really want to understand what's going on in school, you have to understand how things like tracking and ability grouping, affect who gets access to college prep courses. You have to look at how, teachers are treating students in their classrooms and really get a sense, are they being fair with all of their students? Some of the most damaging consequences of all of this that I have seen is that students are more likely to blame themselves than they are the school. Again, in my 21 years of being out in schools, helping schools change, I have maybe met one student who has said, Dr. Jones, the teachers in these schools just really don't do a really good job. One student, one or two maybe, right? A lot of students believe the narrative that they are the problem, right? And so these assumptions and stereotypes affect how students see themselves. It affects whether or not they think that they're able to go to college. And unfortunately, how these stereotypes play out in the larger society absolutely shapes what happens in classrooms. The narrow and false ideas about different groups affect every institution, including education. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit and hopefully do a good job of giving you a sense of what I mean. So I just typed in my computer and Google poor people. You can actually see it. So this is what comes up. Right? When you just Google poor people, right? So, and this is not unique to Google. If you look at news media, social media, even pop culture, right? The way that they're representing the poor, people of color, are usually in incredibly narrow ways. There's only one white family on this image. It looks like they're in a home or an apartment. It's clear there are two parents in this home. I have no doubt this family may be struggling financially, but they look pretty stable when you look at the rest of the images, right? The rest of the images look like they're all in really underdeveloped countries with severe poverty. So again, I just typed in 2 words in Google. So what do these images tell teachers or administrators about kids who come from poor families? Even other images in the media or pop culture absolutely shape our ideas about race, class, gender. So this was a project that a college student actually did. This was maybe a couple of years ago in Pennsylvania, and he gave this like televised talk. It was a TED Talk, and he looked at the effects of representations of race in pop culture. And so I don't know if you all know who this is. This is, a famous rapper, Kendrick Lamar. And so for this student's project, he presented different images of Kendrick Lamar to the same audience and just recorded the conversations that they were having, right? So you can see this image of Kendrick on Rolling Stone, right? I think this photo is pretty representative of Kendrick. He talks a lot about, pain in his songs, struggles, hardships from where he is, right? On the right side, his clothes, I think, make him look like a gang member. Gang members might wear clothes like that. He looks confident, but he's not smiling. His hands in his pocket, which is kind of threatening. Okay, same rapper, different magazine cover, completely different perceptions of Kendrick. Same audience, right? He looks really clean, like he's putting a good impression for people. I think the bottom one on the left is really interesting. He's got the skinny tie on, the cheesy smile, nice fade, but the Kendrick now is not trying to put on a show for anyone. He's real. So this looks a little cheesy to me in that sense. Maybe Kendrick does wear suits, right? Like maybe he does wear suits, right? And then the one on the right, the suit makes him look very sharp, like he's about to go to the Oscar. And then the one above that, I just think he looks more friendly and welcoming, I guess, right? So judgments about how students dress, teachers, administrators, counselors, again, use these all of the time to shape what kinds of access they're going to give kids in school. Last example, and this is pretty recent. A friend of mine actually posted this on Facebook in the this fall. This is her daughter's Sociology 101 textbook. In chapter 9, this class is learning about the concept of deviance, right? But here we have a young Black man being detained by the police. in a textbook, a sociology textbook in Arizona State University, right? Why does this man, when you're a deviant, you violate the rules, you violate the law, you have no respect for the law. So what are the implications that it's an image of a young Black man in a college textbook, right? What does this tell everybody about how they're supposed to view young Black men? So there's a lot of harm that comes from all of these things, right? These are just two of many quotes I can share with you by students, right? One kid in New York, at one time, school was important to me. I liked getting good grades and making my parents proud of me. But in high school, I never felt part of school. It didn't make a difference if I was there or not. The teachers just threw me aside, probably because I was Spanish. I felt like I was being ignored, like I wasn't important. And the California student, that just crushes me. This place hurts my soul, okay? Real harm being done to kids. So what does all this mean, right? What difference does difference make? And so what I mean by that question is, why is the idea of difference, different genders, different races, different ethnic groups, different religions, different social class groups, why is the idea of difference so threatening in this country? I'm going to give you a 2-minute history lesson to show you that this is not new. This goes back to the founding of the United States. So in the 1700s, 1800s, there were millions and millions of Southern European immigrants who came to the United States. So these were Irish, Italian, Jewish, Polish, many, many others. They faced intense prejudice and a lot of violence. Many of them were dirt poor. They could not speak English. They were illiterate, meaning they could not read or write in their own native language. They had very few skills, which made it really hard when they immigrated to the United States to get jobs. They had distinct cultures, distinct traditions, and even distinct religions. Tracking and ability grouping that I talked about a few minutes ago actually started during this time. And it was a way to make sure, political leaders and wealthy elites were really worried that the more popular free public education became, they were worried that immigrants would have all these opportunities and no longer need to work for the wealthy. They would become business owners, right? They would become financially independent. So tracking and ability grouping was partly used to make sure that they were always going to be in their place, right? That they were always going to have just enough education to be able to fill out a job application and work in a factory. That was sort of the goal. I want to give you a sense of this intense prejudice with a couple of images. These are actual political cartoons that were published in newspapers in the United States throughout the 1800s. So this first one is an image, and the title of the image is "On the Backs of the Irish." On the backs of the Irish. So if you look closely, all of the Irish men are clearly, they're in the water. They are holding up this boat, right? They are in pain. This is back-breaking manual labor. And they're, the fat cats on the top are wealthy. They own all the factories, right? Incredibly elite. Publishing this in the newspaper communicates to the entire country that the only thing Irish men are good for is back-breaking manual labor for the elites. That is what this image communicates. I'll give you another example. Again, copies of real cartoons published in United States newspapers in the 1800s. These are about the Italians, right? The Italians face incredible prejudice. They're all mafia, they're all violent and dangerous. They all come from the slums of Europe, they're all poor. These are mice, they're rodents. Italians are not even human beings, they're just rodents, right? Again, published for everybody to know this is where Italians stand. This is where the Irish stand. So, societal norms about difference persist over time and they influence how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we talk about difference. Is it inherently good, inherently bad? How we respond or don't respond, right? That, in school curriculum, discipline policies. And I'm gonna let you in on a little secret, and I just wanna make sure I watch time so I don't talk too long. This is the secret in the United States. So these boxes, boxes around like who's inferior, who's smart, who's superior. These boxes have been around since the founding of the United States. What's changed is who gets put in the box. In the 1700s, 1800s, it was Southern European immigrants that were placed in these boxes of being inferior, not that smart, dangerous. Today, I think that you can probably guess who is now placed in those boxes. People of color, predominantly African-American, Latinx individuals. So when people use, stereotypes to try to understand different groups, and people, unfortunately in the United States, people talk as though those stereotypes are fixed at birth. That if you're Black, you automatically have certain stereotypical traits. If you're Asian, if you're Latinx, you automatically have stereotypical traits. Because people tend to believe that there is a biological basis for race, that biology determines racial characteristics. And so with a little bit of the time that I have left, I want to hopefully, without being too complicated, give you a sense of how this is absolutely false. And then I'll connect this back to where I started around school reform. So there is no biological basis for race. Race is a social construction. So it is widely accepted in the social sciences, even by geneticists, that again, race is not biologically determined. So Michael Omi and Howard Wynette, they're ethnic studies and sociology professors in the 1980s, you can see from this quote, was writing about how everyone learns some combination of racial classification, often without obvious teaching or conscious inculcation. Race becomes common sense. Most social scientists recognize that historical circumstances in society heavily influence racial categories. There's a law professor, Ian Haney Lopez at UC Berkeley. He studies the ways that historic events and the legal system have created racial categories. And again, he says race must be viewed as a social construction. And what he means by that human interaction, rather than natural differentiation, must be seen as the source and continued basis for racial categorization. So, stereotypes become a way to justify inequality. Stereotypes become the reason why students of color don't do as well in school, in comparison to other groups. Stereotypes can be used to rationalize why certain groups don't deserve the same opportunity as other groups. This also affects white people, and I'm going to try to explain how. So these are just two images of books. There is a lot of researchers have written about this phenomenon. Again, remember, Southern European immigrants, distinct language, distinct culture, right? Distinct religion, traditions. How did they become white? When did they stop seeing themselves as Polish, Italian, German, Irish, and started to see themselves as white, right? So whiteness is socially constructed, right? So one of the things that Haney Lopez talks about, right, is that laws, policies, the legal system is coercive, right? They force us, laws in many ways sort of force us to sort of identify in one way or another. I want you to just think for a second about all the paperwork that you have filled out. Okay, just checking on the time. All official forms, paperwork that ask for your race. Job applications, sometimes school applications, sometimes, college applications. Sometimes when you apply for a loan, say for a mortgage, the loan application asks for your race. Some states require, if you're, go to get a marriage license, that you have to put your race, right? So this idea of whiteness was created really to maintain power and privilege. It was all about ensuring that America looked a certain way, that it was uniform and not diverse, right? That you deserve to be here if your looks and your behavior approximate a certain norm of whiteness. You're not practicing your cultural traditions, you're not speaking your native language, but it can also mean your physical appearance. You may or may not have been aware, this has been in the media, certainly the last like 5 years, but there have been a lot of lawsuits by African Americans in corporate America who were fired or were not promoted because they wore their hair natural, like mine, right? So many lawsuits. Did you know that California is the first state, maybe within the last 2 years, 3 years, California is the first state to add an anti-discrimination law for hair, right? So I'm trying to give you some concrete examples, and hopefully it sort of makes sense, some of the things that you might have seen over in the media, right? James Baldwin, very famous writer and activist. I love this. No one was white before he or she came to America. It took generations and a vast amount of coercion. Okay, just checking on the time. So I'm going to give you some examples from Haney Lopez's work that I think will again make this a little bit more concrete. So again, these are real legal cases, right? This is a man who applied for citizenship in the United States in 1920. At the time, courts were still using legal statutes from 1790, where only 3 racial categories were accepted, right? You only had 3 choices, period. And in the court documents, in the legal documents, it says that citizenship had a white person prerequisite. It was all out in the open. So this man, he, tried to bring like documents about his ancestry to prove where he was from, that he does have white in him. He should be able to get citizenship, and it didn't work. The Supreme Court said he was too racially distinct to be categorized as white, and they denied his citizenship. In the 1800s, Mexicans were seen as a nationality, which means they're tied to the country of Mexico. And again, they had 4 choices, right, in terms of their race, all dependent on physical features, right? That was it. However, once the United States started to grow into Texas and California and wanted to take over this land that was part of Mexico, all of a sudden, Mexicans were distinct from other groups, right? They became their own sort of category so that the United States could label them as inferior and justify taking the land that we now call Texas and California. Couple more. So 1909, 4 Armenians sued to establish their racial eligibility for citizenship. Racial eligibility for citizenship. Up until now, they had been categorized as Asiatic. You may or may not have heard that term. It's fallen out of favor a long, long time ago, but the court re-examined which groups could be considered white. And again, because of physical features, they determined that Armenians were not a threat. Again, language used in court documents, that Armenians are not they're not a threat. They can absolutely be considered citizens. 1922, a Japanese-born immigrant again applied for citizenship. Again, the court had to debate this definition of race by skin color. There was a lot of problems, kind of bubbling up. And even though the court recognized that using race or skin color is absolutely inadequate, they still based their decision to deny this man citizenship based on skin color. Last example that I think might be a lot more recent. Okay, 4:45. I can do this in just a few minutes. So maybe some of you took the census this year, right? It's mandated by the Constitution every 10 years. It just gets some basic information about the population. The census is really important. There are billions of federal dollars attached to the census. The federal government uses the census to decide, how much money to send states for building schools, hospitals, repairing roads and freeways, creating new roads and freeways, public safety, Housing, so many more programs, right? Businesses use census data to decide where to build offices, where to build factories. All of that creates jobs, right? But the census has a lot of power in shaping what racial categories matter. And I'm just gonna use images to show you this, because you're not really gonna be able to see this. So these are all of the racial categories from 1790 to 2010. I'll show you a zoomed up version of either end of the continuum. I just want you to see how few categories there are in 1790 compared to how many there are in 2010. So I'll show the zoomed version. So this is from 1790 to 1900 or so, right? You had very few choices, very few, right? Very few choices, right? I can talk about what some of these means, but I don't really have time. Fast forward to the other end of the continuum from 1970 to 2010, right? Look at all these categories. Look at all these categories. This is really important. And one of the reasons why it's really, for the other reasons that I mentioned, in terms of trying to give you a sense of the power of the Census Bureau. So in Los Angeles, around 2020, in like the 2000s, right, for many, many years, in Los Angeles, the Arab and Iranian communities have been lobbying the Census Bureau to create a new category for Middle Eastern and North African individuals. For years, new census was coming out in 2020. In 2018, the Census Bureau announced that it would not create a new category for Middle Eastern or Northern African individuals. Instead, people had to check either white or Black, and then underneath that, write in their origins, right? That was the only choice that you got, right? So for many, the write-in option was infuriating, right? Because many, identify as people of color. So the Bureau's move was seen as a blow to a growing group in the United States already feeling invisible, right? So again, so much power that the legal system, writ large has over how we see ourselves and how we see other people. So wrapping up and going back to this slide, right? In many ways, designing schools with the user in mind means being really honest about how much ideas about race and intelligence influence teachers, administrators, and counselors, right? That if teachers have prejudices against certain groups, like I said before, it does not matter how pretty and shiny that new technology or textbook is. It does not matter. If teachers have some bias related to intelligence or race or class or gender, they are not going to use that new, innovative technical tool in the way that is intended, right? So we have to, include professional development, training, anti-bias, all of those kinds of things. This is the only way, right, that we're going to get all three of these dimensions to work at the same time, so that we actually see change to all the, some of the data that I shared with you in the very beginning of my talk. So that's it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. Questions, comments? How does this resonate for your own experiences in schools, whether, middle school, high school, even UCSD?
If you have go for it. Stephen?
You're calling on me, Ed?
I am.
Yes, thank you. Makina, my name is Steve Clary. I am on the executive committee of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and you are coming as our guest later in the spring. And I think I want to prepare you, and as part of my question is, so what should we do? The historical perspective is one we've all heard. I think my colleagues and I in particular, and today would love to know your recommendations on how do we overcome these issues.
Thank you for that
So my
question. That's a huge question. Are you talking about within education or just sort of
Yeah,
writ large?
let's just stick with education. That's your field of expertise.
Okay. Well, it goes back to what I was saying. You know, most school reform initiatives focus on the stuff, new buildings, new equipment, and they just assume that how teachers see students, how teachers teach, that's just going to magically change with new textbooks and new curriculum. And that's not how it works. That you have to provide training, professional development, resources so that and there is a slew of them. Like, this is not new. That's the other thing I want to make sure, like, we have known this, and there are teacher circles around this country that do that deep reflection all of the time and trying to uncover their own biases and how their biases affect what they do in the classroom. So until school reform initiatives include that kind of, you know, anti-bias professional learning and training, again, it does not matter the other stuff that they throw at schools.
Is that mandated at any, you know, the schools are controlled by the states. Are those dictums mandated to try to overcome some of these issues, which you so, you know, well explained?
I think I can only really speak to California. California has made some strong recommendations for schools, but if you're talking about like a mandate, like there are some real consequences if a school doesn't have anti-bias training, no, we are not there. It takes courage. That's the other part of, you know, all the things I've said about school reform. The leader, the principal, it takes courage to really push teachers outside of their comfort zone to reflect on their own biases.
Well, thanks.
See a question from
Benjamin.
chat. Makeba, are you reading that right now?
Yeah, tracking and ability grouping at higher education. That is a great question. Let me say this, and we'll see if some of you agree. So the reason why UCSD undergraduates have to take a DEI course, right? Like, you can't graduate until you take a course that is part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion category or whatever, was because of some horrible racial incidents that happened on this campus. You know, some of you may know that history. And so one of the recommendations, you know, out of those horrible racial incidents at UCSD, whenever that was, 2010, somewhere around there, one of those recommendations was the DEI class. Was all undergraduates cannot graduate without taking a DEI class. Initially, there was a lot of pushback, right? Because there were people on campus, professors and students, who said, well, you know, why do STEM students, as an example, like, why do they need to take this? Like, this is something that, you know, people of color need. These are something that people who major in ethnic studies, like, they need those classes. Like, why do our students need that? So the suggestion was that STEM students, or basically if you're not a student of color, then you have no reason to think about race, to think about bias, or to think about prejudice, right? That it's only those other students, usually students of color, who are ethnic studies majors or critical gender studies majors, all of that. Those are the groups that need this stuff. But we don't. We're about science. We're about science. So our students don't need this. That's not, you know, quite a perfect example of tracking and ability grouping, but it does show that there's some division, you know, at least initially, around who should take DEI classes.
I got a quick follow-up before we move to the next question. So the DEI then became, it's almost kind of like a mandate in that way, right? It's like there's a lot of pushback, but then with kind of a mandated, you know, what do you think? Have you had any hearings of like what's the perception now about it? Is there, you know, more acceptance, more, has it changed the dialogue, the atmosphere?
That's a good question. I haven't heard too many rumblings. I can only tell you that, I teach a couple of large undergraduate classes, and I've had many STEM students over the years who have never taken a social science class before and initially admitted to me they were dreading taking a class because it was just for the DEI. It wasn't, what they were doing for their major. And they would always come up to me and say, I never realized how much these issues apply to me in my life. And that they were able to reflect on things that had happened to them that they had dismissed is not that important, or they blamed themselves. And they were able to realize that there was something more systemic happening.
Great. There's one more question in the chat. Shall I read it?
Yes, please. I took my glasses
Yeah,
off, so that was
no
a
problem.
mistake.
All right, so Robin asks, many of the paradigms you mentioned relating to students seem to mirror those business or workplaces for employees. Have you looked at any trends and correlation where the experience at school is influencing workplace behaviors or vice versa?
Couple of responses. So one, I was telling this was a while ago, but I was having, it sort of spontaneously came up in one of my classes, talking about what does it mean to be prepared for the workforce as an undergraduate, right? And students were saying, a lot of them again were STEM students saying, oh, I feel really confident, UCSD, this is the top school, it's going to prepare me for engineering, computer science, whatever it is that I'm going to do. And then I relayed this conversation that I had had with somebody who was in a high level position at UCSD Extension, who works with the business community in San Diego. And this is what he said. He said, Makeba, nowadays, I think people have this impression that getting good grades and getting good skills that you learn in college is all you need. And it's like, that's not really the case. Like all the employers, all the top companies that I'm talking to, they're looking for young people who can communicate, who can work on a team, who can write, even if it's an email or a short report. They're looking for young people who can solve problems without a formula, that whatever formulas they learned in college, that they're creative enough to think outside of the box when those formulas don't work in a real work setting, right? And he said, a lot of days, companies aren't really that focused on where you got your bachelor's degree. They're really focused on your interpersonal skills, your communication skills, right? So that's not quite the answer to your question, in the sense that I think colleges are missing out in terms of preparing, students, for certain fields, and the technical focus, the skill development is definitely not quite enough. Not quite enough, actually. Let me stop there. It's kind of a longer answer than I thought it was going to be. I'm not sure if that made sense.
I'm gonna quickly jump in one more time.
Mhm.
How much do you feel like that is a issue where, just like, saying the training needs to happen to the teachers in high school, how much do you think that relaying of you just need to know the formulas, the skill, the, technical thing, is that coming from professors? And how do we get professors to say, for engineering professors to care more about not equations and the people?
That is an excellent question. I don't know the backgrounds of, a lot of the STEM professors, meaning I don't know if they've spent their entire careers in academic life, right? So in other schools, like charter schools, and that's a whole other conversation. Charter schools can hire teachers in ways that, other regular schools can't. But what's so beautiful about charter schools is they will often hire somebody who's in their second career. So somebody who worked as like an engineer for 25 years, then got their teaching credential, and is now teaching high school. Charter schools love those individuals because they help young people understand why you're learning the content that you're learning, like how it actually relates to careers, because these were individuals who spent years in those careers. So again, I don't know the background of a lot of those professors. I think it's a little problematic if they've spent their entire career in academia, right? And not like in the private sector or, some kind of real world experience, so that they would know that more than the technical is important.
Got it. So let's make it one last question with Kristen, and I think we're almost at time.
If you don't mind. So I feel like I've always heard the problem with sort of K through 12 education described as, it's funded by property taxes. And so you end up with all of these issues because if you live in a rich town, you have all these resources, and if you don't, you don't. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about, is that kind of threaded through those three gears that you were kind of identifying: political, cultural? I mean, obviously I can see how it would apply to technical, but sort of, is it threaded through all of those, or is it actually tangential and you could solve these problems without solving, maybe this funding issue?
That's a great question. Funding matters. Absolutely. It is absolutely important. I don't think that you can solve the cultural and the political without addressing the funding issue as well. So, again, I mostly know California. So, I'll give you in terms of the property taxes, right? So maybe this was in the late 1970s, Californians voted to put a cap on certain kinds of property taxes, right? So if they're the same level, all of the time, right? And so a lot of property taxes fund education. So if you're in a low income neighborhood, there's not a lot of businesses, there are not a lot of homeowners, then, there's not as much property taxes going into that, right? But when this happened, in the 1970s, it didn't really dramatically impact middle income and high income neighborhoods, because basically what families did is, okay, so they weren't gonna get, a growing base of property taxes. They would just donate money. They would donate money, equipment. There was some elementary school in Poway, my friend told me, where parents got together and paid for the full-time salary of a music teacher because they wanted music in the school. Low-income neighborhoods can't do that, right? They can't, donate all this money to make up for what they're not getting in the funding. And that feeds into the narrative like, well, parents just don't care. If you really cared about your kids' education, you would be doing everything you could, right? You'd be buying pencils for the classroom, volunteering in the classroom, whatever you can do, right? So it still feeds in that narrative that the system is fine and the problem are the problem is students or their parents. I hope that answers your question.
All right. I think we're at time. Any last thoughts you want to kind of impart with us all? Otherwise, I think we've learned so much.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to kind of hear how some of this fits with some of their own schooling experiences. Yeah, that's always the fun part for me. But hopefully this was informative, and I hope that you learned some things. I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Give one last round of applause. All right.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye, everybody.